Hi and welcome to this webinar. My name is Dimos Georgokitsos and I'm going to present you the features of the new Airlock WAF 7.2. Here with me is Dr. Martin Burkhardt. He's the product manager of Airlock WAF and he will be answering questions you might have. So whenever something is not clear, don't hesitate to use the question tool you are provided with. Martin will answer the questions, and even when the presentation will be finished, we will stay online and clear everything up before we shut down the whole thing. We are concentrating today on three topics. We will talk about Webroot, the central IP address list management. We changed the authentication, and at the end we will sum up with some other features which we just discuss shortly about. Let's start with Webroot. Since Airlock WAF 7.2, we are collaborating with Webroot. This is a threat intelligence feed, which means that they are providing lists of IP addresses which are dangerous. So what you can do is import those lists on your Airlock WAF, and then the Airlock WAF can filter those IP addresses and block them if you want to. Airlock is the OEM vendor of Webroot. This means if you buy an Airlock license with this feature, you don't have to care about the Webroot license because it's included in the Airlock WAF license. The Airlock WAF updates the feed automatically, so you can set up the whole thing and decide how often the Airlock WAF will check for new IP lists. Webroot collects the IP lists by doing different things like setting up spam traps, honeypots, and so on. Then they're doing a threat correlation, and every 5 minutes they're creating a new list of IP addresses which they provide through the internet to the network devices. The Airlock WAF is one of those network devices, so we consume this list, and on the WAF you can decide if you want the WAF to block those IP addresses or if you want to send the information on to the backend. For instance, if you have an IAM there, you can send the information there, and then you can decide there if you want to set up a second authentication step or an additional authentication step or not, depending on the IP address. There are different threat categories, and all those informations are of course logged and provided in the reporting tool, so you can analyze easily what attacks have been or what IP addresses have been blocked through the last whatever you're looking through the logs for. So usually it's through the last 24 hours. The setup is really easy. As I said, the Webroot license is included inside the WAF license. So what you have to do is you go to the system setup, threat intelligence, and here you can just enable the feed and define every how many minutes the Airlock WAF should check for a new list. As I said, the new lists are every 5 minutes, so it makes sense to have a value about 5 minutes or higher. And as soon as you enable this feed, you can go on to the mapping. You want to turn it on. Here we have the verting test mapping. Go to threat intelligence. Sorry, IP rules. And here you have the IP blacklists, the threat intelligence, and there you can define which categories you want to look for. And if you want to just lock those categories, or if you want the Airlock WAF to block them. As you've seen, we have a second change here. So in order to be able to scan for IP lists, we introduced the concept of IP address lists. So what changed now is, up to now you had to define IPs using a regex, and now you can go and define whole lists of IP addresses and name them, and then relate to those groups. So again, let's move to the GUI. System setup, IP address lists. Here you have the definition. So I have a testing net, the intranet, a team called ANET. If you check in here, you see you can use the typical IP notation, and then inside a mapping you can go to the IP rules, and for instance, if you want to set up a test application where only guys from the company should be able to connect, you can define a whitelist and say that only IP addresses from the internet are allowed. And this means no one else can access this application. Or you can go the other way around and say, okay, guys from the internet are allowed, but we don't want tester to be able to access the application yet because it's not finished. So you can blacklist the testing. This means although they are from the internet, they will be blocked because they are on the blacklist. The whole thing works easily. So as soon as you set this up, I have the threat intelligence turned on. So I can access the test environment I just was showing you. But as soon as I change my IP address to one of those which are listed and redo the call, I will be blocked because my IP address seems to be from an attacker IP address. Let me just turn this off again so there is no mistake later. Yeah. As I said, the whitelist and blacklist now reference to whole lists of IP address instead of single IP address or regex. This means wherever you have an IP address inside the configuration, in this version you will still have the regex version, and now you're able to point to lists. And just to inform you, those regex versions of the IP addresses will be removed with the next version probably. So they're deprecated. Please check that they are removed from your configuration. They will show up actually as a warning, so you can follow the warnings and just disable them and move to normal IP address lists. The other nice thing is that those IP address lists are accessible through the REST API, so you can access them or even set them. So if you have another provider providing you with IP address lists, you can, for instance, set up a specific name and then use the REST API to update those lists with those names. And as soon as you activate them, the WAF will scan for the new IP addresses. So you can set up an automatic IP address refreshment yourself. The second big thing which changed is that we made the authentication much more powerful. So up to now, you were able to define one role or multiple roles per mapping, but just for the whole mapping. And what's now possible is that you can go and define for HTTP methods and or paths roles. So this means you can define who can access a GET call on the whole application, who can do posts, patches, and deletes. In this case, the weak authentication wouldn't be enough to do those calls. And in this case, this is a typical case. You can define that anyone who wants to access the admin part of the application has to have an admin role. We moved the whole authentication away from the basic tab into the access tab, so the whole authentication is now done here. You can see there are some similar things which you can define as in the old versions, like the SSL certificates. And here are those access restrictions I just showed you. You can create a new line and then define which HTTP method, which path, and which role is needed. This is, of course, very nice if you're using REST. This was the example from this slide. If you're using REST and you don't want everyone to be able to, for instance, to delete some part of the configuration. Additionally, we enabled the possibility to use JOT tokens. So down here, you have a whole part about access tokens, and you can extract those JOT tokens out of parameters, of headers, of cookies, verify them, and even see if the claims are correct and use claims as roles. So let me go back to the presentation. So you have the header with the information what the JOT token is about, the payload data, and the signature, which is verified, and then you can check that the issuer, for instance, is an issuer you are expecting, or the audition or the target is an application you are protecting. And then you can go on and define which claims are roles. So the Airlock WAF will extract those roles and insert them or use them inside the session, which means that you don't have to do one-shot authentication anymore, but you can rely on those JOT tokens. So it's one round trip which you can save that way. Another thing which is actually somehow small, but at the same time quite big, we updated Kibana to 6.6.2. It's a new, fresh up version of Kibana. It looks nicer. This is actually very specific for every person. But I really like the possibility to enable up here, inside the options, this syntax query. So if I turn this on, it's turned off because it's experimental up to this point. If I turn this on and start typing up here, it will know what kind of strings make sense. So I can go down and define, okay, I'm looking for log ID, I'm looking for a specific type, and it will provide me with the already existing answers. So I can just run this search, and you will see it's included here, log ID summary. So it's easy to type in new searches, and it's even type aware. So if I take a time, for instance, time for backend, it will know that this is a number and provide me with the bigger than, big or smaller, equal, less than equal, greater than equal, and so on and so on. A small change, but I think the everyday life with the log viewer will be much easier when you can use this feature. Okay, those are the three big changes. Let's move on to some smaller points. We added the SSL information into the logs. This means that every time a handshake is done and the SSL connection is established, you will know which cipher was used and which TLS protocol was used. So this will be in future really nice to analyze if you can turn off a protocol or not. In our case, on the right side, you'll see that we don't have TLS 1.1. So if it would be still on, we would know that we can actually easily just turn it off, and no one would be bothered by it because everyone is using the other protocols. So as you've seen on the right side, we are supporting with this version TLS 1.3. By the way, TLS 1.1 is turned off by default, but it's still in there. So if you want to turn it on, you can turn on the weak ciphers and you can still use TLS 1.1, but we turn it off by default. So we have a higher security standard. Then since the last version, the Airlock WAF 7.1, it was possible to have, for instance, inside the cloud to set up a WAF, but outsource the session database, the Redis database inside to another process. And since this version, it's possible to use not only a Redis database, but a Redis cluster. This is actually quite easily set up. If you go back to the GUI, it's here under Application Firewall, Session, and up here you can define which mode you want to use, either the local database, a remote server, or a remote cluster, and then you can define the information down here where to reach this cluster. Then the next point is that we support the Google Cloud Engine. So it's possible to deploy the image as it is on the Google Cloud and use it there. You can check out the online documentation to see what steps are necessary. And one of the last changes we will talk about today is that it's possible to publish the open API specifications, which you can upload since the last version, since 7.1. It's possible to upload the specification and filter according to those specifications. And now it's possible to publish them, because sometimes it's necessary, it's required for an application to publish the open API specification. So you can define on the WAF if it should be published and on which path it should be published. All those changes I talked about, you can find them in the changelog. So if you go to the download page, you can see the changes we have done, the fixes we have done, and the new features, of course, we have done. And you can find information there about those things we were talking about, and even more changes we did. By the way, we are providing update trainings for both our products. In this case, I have a screenshot for the Airlock WAF update trainings. We also have update trainings for the EM, so you can just go to the airlock.com page and register there. And last but not least, you can find this information, or this presentation, on the Tech Zone. So the German version is already up there with the recorded webinar, and we will put the slides as a PDF online for sure today. The video takes some time, but we hope to be able to have it up today or maybe on Monday. So you can check out the video again, or you can point a colleague of yours who missed this presentation to that video, so he or she can check it out and see what changes we did with the Airlock WAF 7.2. Okay, that's it from my side. We will stay online, as I said, if there are still some questions. I didn't have time to check the chat protocol, the questions, so I will go through them. Martin was answering the questions as far as I can see. I will turn off my microphone. Thanks again for joining. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to ask us now or later through the support. And otherwise, have a nice weekend.